Arizona Territory, 1883, the wind carried dust and judgment in equal measure through the streets of Dry Creek. The town whispered when Helena Rourke passed. Women turned their backs outside the mercantile. Men nodded politely, but their wives clutched their children tighter, as if childlessness might be contagious. Helena kept walking, her chin high and her basket filled with stale bread she would not eat. Her home was clean, her garden tidy, and her husband long buried. 5 years gone, and still no child to show for the marriage. The town had made its decision. She was lacking, and no Sunday smile or warm pie would change that. She had stopped trying to explain after the doctor told her what she already knew. Her body had made space once, years ago, but grief had taken that child before breath ever did. No one in Dry Creek ever asked. They just assumed and they judged. Helena had made peace with the silence. Or at least she thought she had, until the day a cowboy rode into town with 2 children and no plan. It was midday when she first saw him. The clatter of hooves broke the quiet, and Helena paused at her gate, a jar of pickled beans still in hand. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a sun-worn hat shading sharp eyes and a square jaw. Dust coated his coat and boots, and behind him, on a weary buckboard, 2 children sat hunched, a girl around 9, a boy a little younger. Both silent, both looking more like ghosts than kids. He stopped outside the sheriff's office. No one came out to greet him. Dry Creek was funny like that. It waited to see if you were worth knowing before it offered you a cup of water. Helena watched as he lifted the girl down gently, then the boy. The girl clung to his hand, though her eyes stayed down. The boy stumbled but caught himself, pressing close to the man's leg like it was the only thing he trusted. Helena's chest tightened. Later that afternoon, she heard the story. His name was Ridge Archer, and he had found the children abandoned outside a burned-out wagon near the Santa Cruz River, 2 days south. Their parents were gone, either fled or dead. The sheriff offered to wire Tucson, but Ridge had shaken his head. "They have no one," he said. "For now, they stay with me." But Dry Creek did not care for sudden families. The saloon owner would not let him rent a room. The boarding house turned him away. The general store watched him too closely. Helena found him again 3 days later, sitting on the edge of the church steps while the children dozed beside him, curled up tight together. His hat was off, fingers laced together as if in prayer, though his eyes were open and tired. "You cannot sleep here," she said quietly. He looked up, blinking, then nodded. "I know, we will move on come morning." "Where to? Where they will not be turned away." Helena glanced at the children. The girl's face was streaked with dirt, her dress 2 sizes too big. The boy's shoes had holes at the toes. "I have a house with 3 beds, Helena said, his brow furrowed. "You do not even know my name." "You saved those children. That is enough for now." He stood, slow and careful not to wake them. "Ridge Archer," she nodded. "Helena Rourke." When they arrived at her home, the children barely spoke. Helena gave them a warm bath and softer clothes from the attic, old things she never got rid of. The boy, Percy, clung to Ridge's leg even in the water. The girl, Polly, never met Helena's eyes, but she allowed her hair to be brushed. That night, Ridge stood in the doorway of the guest room, arms crossed as Helena tucked the children into clean sheets. "You do not need to stay," she said gently. "I do," he replied. "They still wake up screaming," Helena nodded. "Then stay." He slept on the porch the first night. Then, after the second week, he moved to the small room at the back of the house. Dry Creek noticed. They said Helena had taken in a stranger and 2 wild children. That she was trying too hard, as if kindness was a performance, but Ridge saw something else. He watched her kneel in the garden with Polly, teaching her the names of herbs. He watched her guide Percy's small hands as they kneaded bread. He watched the way she never flinched when the children cried or when Ridge himself grew quiet. She just kept offering warmth, not in words, but in steady presence. "You are not afraid of them," he said one evening when the children were asleep and the sky was turning violet. "They are not broken," she said, watching the fire. "They have just been hurt." He looked at her then, long and quiet. "And you?" "I stopped expecting anyone to stay," she said simply, but Ridge stayed. He helped fix the barn roof when a storm pulled half the shingles loose. He took Percy fishing, even though the boy barely spoke. He carved a small horse from cedar and gave it to Polly, who kept it tucked under her pillow. One evening, Helena found Ridge sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. He looked up when she entered. "I never meant to stay this long," he said. She leaned against the doorway. "I know. But every time I think of leaving, I cannot." "Why?" He stood slowly, came toward her. His voice was soft. "Because they sleep through the night now. Because Percy laughs when he is with you. Because Polly hums when you braid her hair." Helena's throat tightened. "And what about you?" Ridge lifted a hand, brushed a curl from her cheek. "Because I finally feel like a man who belongs somewhere." Her breath caught. "I do not have children of my own." "You do now," he said. "If you want us," she looked up at him, eyes wet. "I want you." Then he kissed her slow, sure, with the kind of steady love that does not need to be proven, only lived. Outside, the wind shifted, and for the first time in years, Dry Creek felt like home. The mornings came earlier once the house held more than silence. Polly rose first, always quiet-footed, always careful. She would help Helena gather eggs without being asked, her small hands cradling them like they might crack from a sigh. Percy followed soon after, still blinking sleep from his lashes, tugging on Ridge's trouser leg until he was lifted to the bench for breakfast. Ridge drank his coffee standing, one arm resting on the doorframe, eyes soft as he watched the children eat. After the first frost, Helena started teaching Polly to stitch. Not out of any need, her linens were already mended and folded with care, but because Polly had asked, eyes flicking to Helena's hands as she worked, fingers twitching in mimicry. "Show me," Polly had whispered one afternoon, thumb brushing the edge of the fabric. Helena had paused, then nodded. "We'll begin with straight seams, like planting in rows." Polly had sewn in silence at first, lips tight with focus. But by the third afternoon, she had begun to speak slowly, sparsely. Helena never pressed. The girl's voice came like spring water, not to be forced but welcomed. "My ma used to sing," Polly said once, eyes on the needle. "Not words I knew, just sounds." Helena nodded. "My mother did too." "Sometimes it's the tune that stays, not the words." Polly looked up briefly, then returned to her work. Ridge spent most days repairing fence lines on the edge of Helena's land. He never asked to, but he'd noticed a post leaning and fetched a hammer the next morning. Soon he was fixing the hinge on the back gate, scraping rust from the plow, oiling the barn door latches. Helena let him. She could have done those things herself, but something about the way he moved quietly, deliberately, no expectation of thanks settled the air around him. Like he was keeping the world from shaking loose. One afternoon, as Helena was pulling carrots from the garden bed, Ridge came to stand beside her, a length of rope coiled over one shoulder. "I was thinking," he said, nudging the toe of his boot into the dirt, "about the north field. If we turned the soil before the freeze, it might take seed better come spring." She brushed soil from a carrot weighted in her palm. "I plan to let it rest this year," still could, but even rest takes preparing. She handed him the carrot. "You always talk like you're laying fence and gospel at the same time." He grinned not wide, just enough to show he'd heard her. "Might be I don't know the difference some days." They stood like that for a stretch, earth between them, sky gone pale with late autumn light. Ridge's voice softened. "You ever think about adding to what you've already got here?" Helena didn't answer right away. She lifted a hand to her apron, wiped her palm clean. "I used to," she said finally, "but it felt like I was building for someone who never came." Ridge nodded, slow. "Maybe they just came later than expected." That night, after the children were tucked in, Ridge stayed in the kitchen longer than usual. The lamp was low, the fire down to embers. Helena poured warm water into the basin, washing flour from her hands, sleeves pushed to her elbows. Ridge spoke without looking up from his chair. "You ever wonder if the way things are now is enough?" She dried her hands on a rag, leaned against the counter. "I've wondered if I'm allowed to think so." He stood, came to her slowly. "You are." His hand brushed hers, not by accident. She didn't move away. "I never meant to make a home," she said, voice quiet. "It just happened around me." Ridge stepped closer, the space between them held like breath. "Then let me help keep it standing." She met his eyes. "You already are." This time, their kiss came without hesitation. It didn't ask permission, it gave it when they parted. Helena pressed her forehead to his shoulder, her voice steadier than it had been in years. We'll need to build more shelves if we're keeping winter preserves for 4. Ridge rested a hand at her back. Good. I was getting tired of fixing fences. Outside, the wind had calmed. The cold would come soon, but the warmth inside the house was the kind that stayed. The wind shifted colder by mid-November. Ridge split cedar under the lean-to while Helena stitched a heavier lining into Polly's coat. Percy sat near the hearth, stacking pieces of kindling with the patient focus of a boy who'd once known too much chaos. The rhythm of the household had settled into something that moved without command, quiet, sturdy, unspoken. One morning, while Helena was dusting the front windowsill, a knock sounded at the door, sharp and unfamiliar. She opened it to find Reverend Dobbins standing stiff-backed in his traveling coat, a smile too practiced stretched across his face. "Miss Rourke," he said, tipping his hat, "you've been missed at Sunday service." She stepped aside slightly, not inviting him in. "I've not been unwell, just occupied." He nodded toward the yard where Ridge was harnessing the mule. "With him," Helena folded her arms. "With the children, they aren't yours. They are now." The Reverend's gaze lingered too long before he adjusted his collar. "You know how this town watches. A woman alone, living with a man and 2 strays besides. It may be wise to consider appearances." "I'm not concerned with appearances," she said. "I'm concerned with what's right." His mouth pressed into a thin line. "People talk." "Let them," Ridge said, stepping into view, dust on his sleeves, voice calm but final. Dobbins gave a tight nod and left down the path without another word. Ridge stood beside her, watching him go. "You didn't have to come out." "I heard him," Ridge said. "Didn't like the way he said strays." She closed the door gently, fingers resting on the latch. "That words followed me too." "Not that one exactly, but it's the same weight." He nodded once. "You don't need to explain." "I know," she said, and that truth settled in her chest like firelight. Later that week, Polly came in from the barn clutching a paper-wrapped bundle. Ridge looked up from the table as she placed it in Helena's lap. "I found it under the hay," Polly said, hesitant. "Don't know who it belonged to." Helena unfolded the paper, revealing a child's sketch in charcoal, rough but careful. 2 tall figures, one small. The initials P.A. were pressed into the corner. "Did you draw this?" Helena asked softly. Polly shook her head. "It was already there, but it looks like us." Ridge leaned close, brow furrowed. "That barn's been empty longer than I've been here." "It doesn't matter who made it," Helena said, smoothing the edges. "It matters that she found it." That night, the drawing was pinned above the mantel, beside a faded photograph of Helena's parents. Not because it was art, but because it belonged. The next morning, Ridge returned from town with a sack of nails, a bolt of muslin, and a folded paper he handed Helena without a word. It was a land deed, freshly notarized, with both their names inked across the top. Her eyes traced the letters. "This was mine already. Now it's ours," he said. "If you want it that way." "I do," he nodded, but didn't smile. "I thought maybe we could build something in the Westfield, a proper barn. Maybe a room above it Polly could have when she's older." Helena looked at him, the man who had come with nothing but a wagon and stayed with everything that mattered. "We'll build it." By December, the foundation was staked. Ridge worked in the mornings while Helena taught the children their letters beside the stove. Percy puzzled over each shape with his tongue between his teeth. Polly took to reading faster than anyone expected. Though she never asked questions aloud, she just read until the page made sense. One snowy evening, Helena found Ridge sitting on the porch's edge, coat unbuttoned, hat resting beside him. She handed him a tin cup and sat close, shoulder to his. "I got a wire today," he said after a while. "From a man I used to ride with. Says there's work in Santa Fe come spring." "Good money?" She didn't answer at first. The snow was falling soft, catching in his hair. "You thinking of going?" He looked at her and then at the lighted window behind them where the children's shadows passed across the curtains. "No," she took his hand. "You sure?" He turned his palm up, laced their fingers. "There was a time I thought drifting was the only thing I had left, but now I've got something that doesn't move." Her voice was quiet. "You've got us." He nodded. And that's more than I ever thought I'd be given. They sat there until the snow covered the steps, until the cold crept up through the boards, but neither moved. There was nothing ahead of them they needed to chase, not anymore. The world had found its shape, and it fit. By late January, the snow made a hush of everything. It blanketed the roof in thick white, softened the fence lines, and dulled the sound of the mule's hooves when Ridge rode out to check the trap lines. Helena kept the stove burning long past dusk, adding kindling with practiced hands, while Polly read aloud by lamplight. Percy preferred to listen with his head against Ridge's leg, quiet and still, his eyes following the rise and fall of the girl's voice. One morning, after the snow had crusted hard enough to walk over, Ridge found a set of rabbit tracks near the chicken coop. He was crouched, studying them, when Polly leaned out the kitchen door, her shawl tight around her shoulders. "Something wrong?" she asked, her breath puffing in the cold. "Just tracks," Ridge said, "but not one I've seen this close before." Polly stepped out beside him, careful not to slip. "Could be a fox," he shook his head. "Too light, might be a lone coyote, hungry one," Polly frowned. "Will it come back?" He stood, brushing snow from his knees. "If it thinks there's easy food." That evening, Ridge built a second latch across the coop door. Helena watched from the barn threshold, her arms folded against the wind. "You think it's bold enough to try the henhouse?" "Maybe," he said, straightening. "But I'd rather be ready than sorry." She nodded, walking toward him. "You always carry that weight, don't you? Like something's waiting to go wrong unless your hands are on it." He met her eyes. "I've seen what happens when they're not." She stepped closer, her voice low. "You don't have to hold everything together alone." That night, they lay in the same bed for the first time, not out of passion, but because Helena had reached for his hand in the dark and he'd come willingly. The room was quiet, but not silent. Percy's breathing from the next room, the creak of the wind against the eaves. Ridge's arm curled around her, and she rested her head against his chest. When she spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "Do you think they remember enough to forget?" "I think they remember enough to heal," he said. She closed her eyes. "Then we just keep giving them room." Ridge kissed her hair, and each other. By the third week of February, Polly had begun drawing again. Helena found scraps of paper tucked into the corners of the bookshelf, sketches of the barn, the mule, Ridge's hands holding a hammer. One afternoon, Polly placed a folded page on the kitchen table and slid it toward Helena without a word. It was a drawing of the four of them at the creek bed. Polly had drawn Ridge with a fishing pole, Helena kneeling beside Percy to show him a frog. Above them, the sun was bright and round, and everyone was smiling. Helena looked up. "You see us like this?" Polly shrugged. "It's how it felt." Helena reached for her hand. "Then it's true." A few days later, Percy began waking with night sweats again. Ridge took to sitting beside his bed until he drifted back to sleep. One night, Helena came in and found Ridge with his hand on the boy's back, steadying his breath. "He's not calling for anyone anymore," Ridge said softly. "What does that mean?" Ridge glanced at her. "Means maybe he stopped waiting to be left." The next morning, Percy asked if he could feed the hens by himself. Helena handed him the basket without comment, but watched from the window. He moved with care, not rushing, not stumbling, just steady. As the sun starting to rise, by March, the ground began to soften. The path to town lost its ice, and the creek trickled again beneath the thaw. Helena went into Dry Creek for flour and salt, and this time the clerk handed her the sack without hesitation. "You keeping help on out there?" he asked, eyes flicking to the window. "I have a family," she said. He didn't argue. Outside, Ridge was hitching the wagon. Polly sat beside him, her braid tucked under her cap, and Percy was pointing at something in the sky, his mouth open in awe. Helena stepped into the wagon bed, the flour sack settled beside her boots. As they turned onto the road leading home, Ridge reached across and took her hand without looking. She laced their fingers. "You still thinking about that barn loft?" she asked. "Already cut the timber. You planning on asking me to marry you in it?" He smiled. "No, I was planning to ask you right now," she laughed, startled. "You have nothing prepared." "I've prepared every day since I met you." She looked at him, then at the children, then back at the road ahead. "Then yes," she said. "Yes to all of it." and when they reached the house, Polly jumped down first. Percy followed, running to the porch. Ridge helped Helena down, and they stood a moment in the yard, the wind tugging at their coats, the sun just beginning to warm the earth. They didn't need to say it again. It was already happening around them. By the middle of March, the thaw had reached the roots. Ridge's boot prints held shape in the damp ground, and Polly had begun marking the wall beside the washstand with a bit of chalk, measuring Percy's height in careful lines. Helena noticed the way Ridge always paused by the doorframe longer now, as if committing the small sounds to memory: the clatter of spoons, Polly's quiet humming, Percy's bare feet padding across the floorboards. One afternoon, Helena stood in the shed sorting seed sacks while Ridge trimmed the low branches from the orchard trees. Polly was inside with Percy, helping him fold a clean shirt for Sunday. Helena ran her thumb across the cloth label she'd stitched herself earlier that winter, initials in blue thread. PA and PR. Ridge stepped into the doorway, carrying a handful of trimmed twigs. "Found a bird's nest," he said, setting them beside her. "Empty now, but it's built strong." She brushed dirt from her palms. "They come back when they trust the place." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "You made something here," he said, "something I didn't believe I'd ever have." She looked up, catching the roughness in his voice. "Then stay, not because you feel you owe us anything, but because you want to belong." "I do," he said. "I already do." She took a step toward him, laying a hand flat over his heart. "Then let's make it proper." They married on a Thursday beneath the cottonwood near the west field. The same tree Ridge had cleared around that winter, its bark still bearing the mark of his hatchet. Polly wore a ribbon Helena had found tucked in an old chest, and Percy held the basket of early wildflowers he'd gathered himself. Helena wore the same boots she tended the garden in, and Ridge had scrubbed the dust from his collar so thoroughly the fabric faded to pale gray. They spoke their vows with no witnesses but the children and the land, no preacher, no paper, just Ridge's voice steady as he promised her a life built from the ground up, and Helena's hand in his as she gave him her trust, not new but newly named. Afterward, Polly handed Helena a folded page. It was a fresh drawing, 4 figures in front of a barn rising from the earth, beams half raised, sky wide behind them. Percy had colored the sun himself, yellow rubbed blunt at the edges. They built the barn together across the weeks that followed. Ridge laid the frame with methodical care, and Helena joined him with a hammer when the children were napping. Polly swept the floor before the roof was even finished, and Percy drew figures in the sawdust with a stick until his fingers were raw. At night, Helena and Ridge sat on the porch steps, their coats touching, not speaking unless something needed saying. One evening, Ridge cleared his throat. "You think you'll ever want more?" he asked. "Beyond this," she shook her head. "Not more. Just deeper." By early summer, the loft above the barn was complete. Polly moved her blanket chest and sketchbook there, taking up the corner nearest the window. Percy planted sunflower seeds outside the door, waiting each day for sprouts. Helena taught them how to shape cornbread by feel, no measurements, just the weight in the bowl and the warmth of the skillet. Ridge carved wooden spoons in the evenings, handing them out one by one, initials etched into each handle. Polly kept hers tucked beside her sketchbook. Percy used his every morning. Helena's stayed by the stove. Ridge's rested on the kitchen windowsill, beside a smooth stone Helena had once pressed into his palm the day after they'd buried the old hen. One Sunday, as they crossed the field toward the creek, Polly turned to Ridge. "Do you think we'll stay here forever?" He looked at her, then at Helena, then at the boy trailing behind them with a fishing pole too long for his arms. "Forever's just another word for home," he said. "And we already found it." That night, Helena lay beside him, the windows open to the breeze and the quiet murmur of frogs beyond the fence line. Ridge reached for her hand beneath the quilt, his thumb brushing the inside of her palm. "I never thought a quiet life would suit me," he said. She turned her face toward him. "It suits you because you earned it," he smiled faintly, the kind that didn't ask to be noticed. "So did you." She pressed her forehead to his. "Then we'll keep it together." And they did. The barn weathered its first storm without creaking. The sunflowers grew taller than Percy. Polly filled 3 pages with scenes of Ridge and Helena in the orchard, the lines finer now, more certain. Ridge built a bench beneath the cottonwood where they'd married, and Helena planted mint around its base. By the next spring, Polly had begun writing stories to go with her drawings, and Percy learned to whistle. Ridge's name was carved into the back gatepost beside Helena's, the wood smoothed by wind and time. Their life wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, it was steady, and it held.